Hello, everyone. My name is Maria Herrera, and I'm a committee member at the City Architecture Forum. Welcome to this evening event. That is the first of a series of online events that the Architecture Forum will be hosting in 2021. We started with these online lectures last March when the first lockdown came, and since then we have developed this to a more comprehensive project of online panel discussions and conversations. So today's event, we will be focusing on the re-landscaping of Exchange Square, which will become a new public park at the heart of the Broadgate development. So to talk about the event, I am delighted joined by Deborah Saunt and Tom Greenall from DSDHA and James Fox from FFLO. By way of a brief introduction to the speakers, Deborah is a co-founder of the architecture, urban design and spatial research studio DSDHA, who landscape-led master plans and is a people-centered approach. Deborah also helped co-founded the London School of Architecture, on which now she's the trustee, and among her academic appointments, most recently, Deborah has taught at Yale as the Erasanian visiting professor of architectural design. We're also welcoming Tom Greenall, who is an associate director at DSDHA. Tom is the project director of the work for the Broadgate Public Realm Framework Plan, which we will be talking about this evening. And his experience covers a range of scales and sectors, from the landscape design of the Royal Albert Hall to residential and commercial schemes. Tom has also taught at the School of Architecture at the Royal College of Art and the University of Westminster. And we're also welcoming James Fox, who is a partner at FFLO, which is a practice that was established with Claire Fernley in 2015. Tom has a background in philosophy, design, and technology before becoming a landscape architect. So James worked closely together with DSDHA in the development of Exchange Square, and he's currently working with Eric Parry Architects on a new landscape design for St. Martin in the Fields Church. Great, so without further introductions, I will hand over now to Deborah to commence the presentation. We will have some time for questions, so if you can please log them in through the chat box, and we'll address them towards the end. Thank you. Over to you, Deborah.
Thank you so much. Now, I'm hoping that you're seeing my screen. Is that right, Tom?
Yeah, that's right.
Good. Is it filling the screen correctly? I'm sorry, I can't quite see at the moment. So should I make it a bit bigger?
I think if you can make it a bit bigger. Well,
yeah. Should I try that? Great. Okay. Yeah, so I should let you know that this evening, because this is such a collaborative effort in bringing this amazing project all together, we thought we'd try something a little different this time and use a technique that I've been using in my teaching, particularly at Yale last semester, where we use Miro boards as our presentation and kind of discussion platform. So what we're going to be doing is each of us will be sort of taking over from the other as we sort of meander through our sort of the evolution, and it's kind of sort of workshop approach, which is really the way that we work collaboratively. So just by way of warning, we'll try to keep the movements to a minimum so that you don't get seasick, because I know some people have said that occasionally it does make you feel like you're going on a slightly strange journey as you move between images. but it's very useful if you need to go backwards and forwards and to sort of highlight certain things. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. So this was sort of Broadgate a few years ago when DSDHA got invited by British Land to look at the kind of landscape future of this really important part of the city, you know, really iconic destination. And for us, it was a really huge privilege because until this time, we hadn't made that many sort of landscape and public realm projects. And so that they held a competition with us and several other landscape architects. And it really was to sort of reimagine the landscape of the public realm above and around Liverpool Street Station, as I'm sure you're aware, but to really see whether one could change this environment from its sort of preconception as a sort of a campus into being more integrated as a piece of city, and to really sort of embed welfare at its heart. So we were aware of the importance of Broadgate within the city, because as a piece, it was originally an extension of the boundary of the city was extended indeed to accommodate this new development. And we were very aware that Exchange Square played a really important role in the heart of this development, along with the other public spaces, because there really is so little public space in the area. So being outdoors, we know there are most incredible public spaces, sort of small and found public spaces, but the sort of largest green spaces are indeed private nearby. So opening this up to provide generosity was key to what we began looking at. So we went to site as part of the competition and just gave our really honest assessment of what it was like to come into somewhere like the Circle, with which you might be familiar. This is back in 2015, I think, isn't it, Tom?
That's right.
Sorry?
Yeah, you're right. You got it right.
Up into Exchange Square, where we had world-class architecture, but there was some really great green visual amenity and sheltered spaces. But it was quite hard to negotiate, particularly with these huge changes in level with lots and lots of steps. And then when you came into the site in particular, there was a feeling of a sort of almost a kind of barrier that had been placed on plan, a very beautiful curving sandstone feature. But really, once one had made the journey to Exchange Square, you were almost repelled by some of the original architectural moves or landscape moves that had been made. And I think our most sort of poignant commentary from a horticultural point of view, James might agree, was there was a preponderance of what we called suburban planting in these rather awkward planters. And the sense of nature seemed to be extremely mediated and sort of controlled. So the idea of being outside, we wanted people to really feel that. As part of the competition, we set out with our whole studio to look at what people were doing in the site. And we did a kind of quick survey of discovering how people were using it, discovering things, for example, like in Exchange Square, there was a great view, but in order to get there, you had to go through the belly of the machine, it says here, and that there was a sort of unpleasant route nearby that was very convenient. So it was a kind of ganglion of things going on, and we wanted to bring a simplicity and clarity to it. So our commission was to look at all of the public spaces originally, and not to come up with permanent solutions, but just to see what we could do as quick, agile, temporal interventions, particularly in the Circle that had just been refurbished, in Finsbury Avenue Square, next to the Foggo building that was being just about to be refurbished, at the base of the Broadgate Tower and Broadgate Plaza, and then long term to look at what might possibly happen here at Exchange Square. So some of the first things we did were to look at how we might take those conditions as found, sorry for moving in a rather cumbersome fashion here, to look at how we might find a particular landscape quality and sort of environmental quality. So I think it was Tom who landed on this idea of biomes, of looking at the way that throughout the spaces there were these different kind of microclimates, and one could almost relate them to the different temperate or sort of subarctic even, or tropical regions that one finds within the sort of biodiversity of the world. And as such, we ascribed the warm space of Broadgate circles with a Mediterranean environment, the woodland, almost sort of Scandinavian Nordic feel of Finsbury Avenue Square, the Exchange Square as a verdant place. We really wanted that to be a wildflower and kind of super abundant environment. And then we looked at the plaza as being potentially bamboo. But we also managed to do some more research, which was one of our first requests to the client, was to ask for their CCTV footage, forgive me, of the circle, which was our first project that we looked at. And from this, we could understand how the space changed from being very busy to also being very empty. So you'll see people just really clinging to the edges here, and this rather intimidating void in the center. In fact, if I just go over here to the right, we made this map which really showed there was a huge amount of commuting going on through this square, and a large amount of what we call vertical drinking coming out from the bars to one side, and that was almost sort of creating quite a kind of hostile environment for people, or as I said, sort of intimidating. So from that, we looked at our Mediterranean designation that we'd given it, and looked at disrupting that flow and disrupting that centrality and creating a series of mobile landscape elements that would give a kind of intimacy to an otherwise very grandiose space. This was installed about 3 years ago, and it's proved incredibly popular. There's a series of really intimate settings. It's much more occupied during the day now, and all days of the week, particularly at weekends, as you can see here from a few of these wonderful images. In fact, the image on the left shows them being installed and how they're hard to move, but they are certainly mobile, and that's proved useful during the pandemic. We also did the same kind of research on Finsbury Avenue Square, which really was a rather cool environment, particularly with this sort of strong grid and the sort of darker buildings next door. We took that and created a rather wonderful screen with a few retail units inside of containers that would act as a kind of active hoarding. And we really think this should be used everywhere, this active hoarding to the building site behind as the Fogo building was being restored. And we built several almost kind of craggy spaces to sit. And indeed, this is not prosed. People really do find these as wonderful places to inhabit, but they're very carefully located so as to minimize the amount of disruption. Meanwhile, I'm just going to go further down here under the Broadgate Tower in a rather challenging space with a large amount of sort of wind upon occasion, and again, quite a cool kind of architecture. We managed to reimagine this by removing the sadly dying trees. Sorry, just coming over here now, and reimagined it as a bamboosery. This, in fact, was a landscape phenomenon a few centuries ago of this exotic intensity, and the rustling sound of these beautiful bamboos really creates a kind of intimacy again near this heroic architecture. And what we discovered was that people behaved in a rather interesting way within it. Sorry, just come over here. As a piece of research, the whole idea of these temporary pieces was to see how people responded and to sort of uncover the needs and kind of hidden latent potential of Broadgate as a piece of the city. So we found there were activities going on, sort of channeling the Asian sort of sentiment of the bamboo. There were intimate spaces and indeed for charging your mobile phones here on the benches that you could stay and work, and people indeed were using them for work. And then most entertaining of them all perhaps were some of the activities we found of people using the spaces for activity that they posted on Instagram. We hadn't predicted this, we hadn't sought it as one of the aims of the project, but we found this desire for well-being and fitness really manifesting itself here, particularly the chap on the right. And it was also becoming a place for sort of photo shoots, fashion, and a kind of new audience. So armed with this, we set about our journey looking at the landscape and the architecture of Exchange Square. And at this point, I'm going to zoom out and hand over on this rather fine image of what was to be awaiting once the design got going. So over to you, James.
Spoiler alert, don't look at that picture. Right.
It was more about the view looking over the train station that our research had uncovered from those comments. So I'll let you take over.
There we go. So here we are in Exchange Square, and that process of experimentation and trialing projects, which actually some of those projects have already disappeared because the building sites they were shrouding are gone, or the planters have moved around somewhere else, whatever. That process of trialing eventually brought us to the position of being asked to look at Exchange Square, not as a temporary scheme, but as a significant permanent scheme. So we began to look at it and we wondered, what sort of a place is this? We were discussing it earlier in the week. It can be very hard to conceptualize landscapes because they're so solid and they're present and they have such a strong existence. It can be very hard to imagine them to be anything other than what they are. So we began a process of exploring what kind of place this could be through drawings and models. And the first thing we did was we began to draw what it is. And actually through drawing what it is, we noticed something, which is, sorry to squeeze around so much. What we noticed was that although one thinks of it as a green space, in fact, it's a tiny postage stamp of green here, surrounded by a great ocean of paving. And we noticed this actually not through hanging about in the square so much as drawing it. So this was the first drawing we did, and it was a drawing that actually also encapsulated the space under Exchange House here and the bamboosery up there at Broadgate Plaza that we had already worked on. So it was thinking of this actually as a broader space. And when you look at it all together, you realize that it's not only big, but it's incredibly stony. So we asked ourselves, well, forget all of that. Forget the shape of the amphitheatre and the strange wall, which Deborah showed with the scissors on it. Indeed, cut those things out. And let's start with a blank canvas and ask ourselves, so what are the potentials here? What can happen? And we drew it blank. And over here, we modelled the space blank as well, just as a way of beginning to explore what the possibilities were here beyond what we found there already. And we came to the conclusion that we needed to think of the space not as a paved space with some landscape in it, but as a landscape with some paths in it, which is a critical distinction, which I think actually makes the shift in typology between square and park. So a park is often surrounded by, you know, a road or some paving, whatever. A square, sorry, is often surrounded by a road or some paving or whatever, and in the middle there's a patch of green. Whereas a park is a green space that you go through. And this was a really kind of important shift in our thinking about what kind of place this ought to be. And indeed, nowadays, we think of it, and the project is called Exchange Park, not Exchange Square. Historically, Broadgate, when it was originally bought, it was a relatively cheap site because it was two strips of development to the east and the west of Liverpool Street Station, with the trains coming out of Liverpool Street Station. And as such, both strip was slightly undervalued because they only had a streetscape to one side. And really a brilliant move that the developers made was to build a huge bridge over the railway line here between the two strips of development. And that bridge is partially Exchange Park, as it will be, or Exchange Square as it was then, and partially Exchange House, which you can see here. So here's Liverpool Street, here's the railway line coming across, and here is this really brilliant move to join up the two strips of land that they owned either side of Liverpool Street Station to make a campus. And that campus, of course, had Exchange Square at its heart. So when we began working on the project, we were actually thinking about this layered landscape of elements that existed there. And we wondered how we could acknowledge the fact that actually this is an artificial landscape and it's just one layer of many. At the bottom are the tube trains, then the trains themselves. Then we have our strip of green, Exchange Square or Exchange Park, and then buildings bridging over above. And even to either side of Exchange Square, these little tunnels for people to find their way through. So actually, although we experience it as a surface, it's this amazing stratified artificial landscape that we're moving through when we're there. Which you can see a little section of there, how it works over the station. And we thought about this stratification, and we thought about artificiality, and we thought about how something natural and something artificial could come together. And we had the idea, and it was just a fairly loose idea, of artificial rocks. And we thought of this kind of strange artificial strata of rock that we might run through not just Exchange Park as it would be, but also through to Broadgate Plaza beyond. And we looked at the shapes of rocks. And we also looked at the flows of people through the square and how the shapes of rocks might somehow inform or help people to move around the space. And we looked at historic interpretations of rocks. This Renaissance drawing of, I think it's St. Jerome in the rocks with his donkey, and we analysed the way the rocks were working in the view to frame the landscape and to mediate between the people and the landscape they were inhabiting. And we did fun sketches of artificial rocks to explore what they might look like in the context of these arch forms of the station. And although we haven't drawn it, the more rigid geometry here of the buildings around, we've modelled the rocks, 3 dimensions. Rocks are quite a handy form, especially artificial rocks, because there's quite a complex topography we needed to negotiate here. And here we eventually reached the end of stage 3 with our rocky proposal. You can see that there's some strong affinities actually with some of the things that have gone before here. So the planters that Tom and Deborah and David designed in Exchange Circle had this kind of stratified nature. And in fact, we thought of them as rocks in a Mediterranean landscape. So there's a kind of learning from other projects coming through here. And people would inhabit these rocks as they do inhabit those planters in Exchange Square. So there was our proposal in the circle, which Deborah has already talked about. So there was our proposal, but no, we got to that point and a British Land looked at it all, and they're a very liberal client and actually very supportive of our ideas all the way through, including the artificial rock idea. But they looked at it all at this stage and they just thought, this is a bit too much. But they kindly, rather than telling us that we had a bad idea, they said, you know, there's many good things about this, but you just need to rethink it because the rocks are too much. So we tried to think about what the essence of it was that we really still wanted to achieve, even though the rocks were gone. One thing was we enjoyed that the geometry of the rocks, although it responded to the surroundings, particularly the topography of the site, it was also contrary to them. And in this way, we felt it created perhaps a more of a natural feeling space. And we also thought that somehow this movement through the rocks would allow people to slow down and inhabit the place in a more gentle and perhaps more intimate way, as Deborah's shown actually with the bamboozlery that we made and the rocks. It's all the same idea really, but interpreted at different scales. And we showed the idea, we forgot about the rocks, but we showed the idea of these kind of simple curving lines that draw you through the landscape and how they're in some ways contradictory or contrary to the more rigorous lines of the city and people rushing about going from place to place in the most direct line they can. And we did more sketches as before, exploring how these lines may bring people in a more gentle way through this landscape. And these sketches developed into more beautiful sketches, exploring how these gentle lines moving topography work against the geometry of the station with its curve, and then the more orthogonal geometry of the buildings around. So I just wanted to sort of take you on that journey of exploration really of the project, what its potential was and how it could be, that was mainly done through drawing and modelling and workshops. Wanted to mention actually also the client Bernard, who worked with us through this phase, was extremely supportive and brought many of his own ideas as well. Okay, well at that stage I'm going to stop sharing and it will be over to Tom.
Great, thank you, James. Let's see what I can do. Right, so yeah, hi everyone. You are now with me for the remainder of the presentation, and I'm going to take you through, I guess, the design as it is being constructed at the moment. So we are on site. We started just before Christmas, and our anticipated practical completion date is Christmas Eve this year. So something to look forward to, hopefully. So everyone through James' presentation, through Deborah's presentation, you've had a sort of a glimpse into the design that has started to emerge for Exchange Square, which is captured by the plan that's on the screen at the moment. And I guess what was always important to us was to draw not only the square but the wider connections to it, and that was, I guess, one of the core kind of values or principles that was established by the team, by our client team, and by the design team very early on. That first and foremost, this was no longer about the square being a kind of protected environment in the heart of a commercial enclave. This was almost about doing the opposite, kind of turning Broadgate inside out in order to welcome people through and to really kind of increase the kind of porosity of the site, the permeability of the site, and to kind of offer up these kind of generous public realm spaces within what was previously considered to be a campus as kind of genuine public spaces within the city. So I guess that was the kind of the first and foremost, that was the kind of primary objective or the primary value that we brought to the project. Secondly, and importantly to mention, for us, it was essential that this landscape was entirely accessible to everyone. So it was accessible and it was inclusive. And that really meant doing away with all those ramps and steps that kind of almost like divided the space. And in dividing the space created actually barriers to access rather than means of access. And then the third value, and one that I think the importance of can't be really overstretched kind of overstressed at the moment, was that we were keen through this project to address the crisis, the biodiversity crisis that we find ourselves in at the moment. So we wanted to not only increase the amount of green space, green amenity space that was accessible to people, but also increase the biodiversity of the site through kind of not more monocultural landscapes, but through lush, dense and varied planting. So all of those things are captured in the plan that you can see on the screen at the moment. This plan was, as James mentioned, predicated on studies about movement around the site. It's a pan over here. So, I mean, we spent a lot of time at Broadgate really analysing how people use the space at the moment in order to understand desire lines, perhaps kind of less anticipated connections between certain kind of elements of the estate. And what this really revealed when it came to Exchange Square was just how prominent this north-south route is, from Liverpool Street Station at the south through Exchange House's undercross space, through the plaza or onto Bishopsgate. And this is really only going to get stronger as developments like Principal Place to the north and other developments within Shoreditch kind of really kind of enforce that that expansion of the city. But one of the issues that we realised was that with this north-south circulation, because of the imposition of this landscape feature within the design, as shown here, you can easily pass through the space without even coming into contact with a piece of greenery. So the wall does act as a complete block to the small lawn that sits in the middle. And I guess secondly, and important to mention, is that as a railway sidings or as a kind of a gorge carved into the ground to allow the trains to pass underneath, there was a real severance caused by the railways to east-west movement. Something that was also a kind of like a criticism of the campus mentality of the site. It kind of severed off areas of the city and didn't really address some of the problems that had been created by the imposition of the railways in the first place. So with that in mind, we undertook a study of anticipated movement, which is shown in orange. So this is how we thought people would want to move through the space if features within the landscape didn't prevent that from happening. And through doing this, we've opened up more routes to connect Bishopsgate on the east with Apple Street on the west, to really help to support kind of greater permeability through the site, to allow people to pass through, but also to allow more people to come in and enjoy that landscape. As you can see here with this overlay, those kind of routes and kind of paths that were carved through the landscape, as James mentioned, so paths carved through green space as opposed to a green space in the middle of a square, they facilitate both kind of direct movement, north, south, east, west, along routes that we know are kind of perhaps popular commuter routes, but it also importantly created a series of secondary, less direct routes, or even these kind of exploratory routes through the landscape, which allowed a kind of different pace of occupation of that space. Those spaces that are in between where people move are then given over to areas for activity. So one of our criticisms of the existing design was that the lawn space in the middle was also allocated as the activity space. So on a seasonal basis, the lawn would be ripped up or destroyed for events to take place, and then it would be re-landscaped. Our design was predicated on creating spaces where activities could happen without any disturbance or disruption to the planting. So a series of large zones are created within the design for different types and scales of activity. And then lastly, Exchange Square in the summer, if you've ever been there when the screen's been on and when the tennis has been playing, is incredibly busy space. Thousands of people congregate here. So there was a need for additional retail to both support kind of activity within the space, but also to, I guess, help kind of finance the upkeep and the maintenance of what was quite kind of an extensive landscape scheme. So the design includes a new retail unit that just hugs the corner of the space grown out of the landscape, and also framing the activity space in the centre of the design. So all of those considerations led to the design, or kind of a design very similar to what you can see on the screen at the moment. And one of the key things, in addition to these kind of smooth, kind of accessible step-free routes through the space, one of the key landscape gestures is this wavy line that is cast through the middle of the site. So this line describes kind of new topography, or at least it allows a new topography for the site to be established around that line. So hugging the line, we have seating, we have a water feature, it emerges out to create the retail unit. So off this line, it really becomes a kind of a spine through the space onto which different kind of activities are grafted, but it helps to structure the new environment. So just to give you a little glimpse of how this space will look, here you can see that main north-south movement route with the view to the plaza beyond, but also you can see in front of you here the kind of less direct and less clear secondary route that kind of draws you into that space between really verdant planting that offers a kind of strong kind of sensory experience as you move through the space. And then what you can see here just grown out the landscape is that integrated retail unit that emerges from the ground to form a new kind of peninsula. That's perhaps more easily understood by this drawing here, where you can see this line just cast its way through the landscape or traverse the landscape, weaving through it, and then just emerging out of the ground here very gradually to create the canopy for a retail unit. So it acts as both a kind of a step, an anchoring device, a seat, and then also shelter for sitting beneath as part of the cafe. And then on top of the line, on this location here, you create a peninsula that gives you kind of amazing new views into the Grade 2 listed shed of Liverpool Street Station. So again, just to show you what that might look like, slightly more kind of photorealistically. Here again, we see the line describe its way through the landscape, emerging out and creating a new planted terrace, so extra green space in the square. It's also worth just noting here this reconfigured water feature in the space, which is intended to be fully accessible, something that children can come and play in, particularly in the summer, which is a series of shallow pools that just cascade their way through the landscape. So something a lot less formal than the type of water feature that you might have expected to find within a commercial development. And that line, I think it's important to kind of reinforce what James said. The line was really about kind of making sure that the connection to the railways and kind of life below the park to kind of acknowledge that this is a completely constructed landscape as opposed to something that's, you know, planted at grade. So it was inspired by the kind of the form and the materiality of the railway tracks that passed below. So the design and the kind of profile of these was used to design or to inform the design of a series of cassettes or kind of almost like vertebrae that form this line, into which we've integrated opportunities for lighting, but also other kind of less expected features. It's a big part of the process with this project. It was a process of testing, prototyping, exploring materials and how they weather, and also I think not being too precious about how they weathered, but just enjoying the fact that you know, we wanted the site to have a sense of kind of temporality or kind of duration. So these were a series of mock-ups photographed in our yard in Vauxhall where we work. You can see here how they form part of a larger mock-up. And if I get this going, this perhaps starts to ask a question about how many architects it takes to try and move a mock-up out of a warehouse next door to our building. But eventually we did manage to drag it out. This is it, kind of pride of place in the yard. So here you can kind of see how this line starts to establish kind of a series of different opportunities. So both a kind of a step or a kind of a datum to the landscape, but also something on top of which a kind of a new seat, a new kind of winding seat kind of anchors itself. And I guess the perhaps less expected feature that I mentioned earlier is, you know, I guess like the schedule of the trains that pass by underneath, at certain times of day, mist will emerge from this line to create kind of similar effects to these. Something that our team are currently prototyping and testing in a warehouse out in Weybridge at the moment. So that this, you know, the experience of this site will never be the same place twice. At different times of day, the whole site will appear, you know, entirely different, which is something that I think kind of will enrich it as somewhere that people will continue to go back to. So here's just to give you another overview of the design that's being built. Here you see that water feature here, which forms part of this line from which the mist creates. But another kind of, I guess, important feature or an important material throughout the landscape is the material of these kind of edges to the lawns and also to this large kind of seated, kind of tiered amphitheatre area in the middle. And this is a material that we've lovingly tested and honed over the last couple of years. Seen here in a mock-up sample that was made for us in Verona in Italy before being assembled by the stonemasons around me next door to our office. So you can see how they've assembled it with these seams. And you can just see here how this process to create this texture, this kind of fairly kind of like labor intensive or kind of like labor of love that's applied to the way that the stone is finished in order to create these kind of shallow dishes which become the pools of the water feature. So again, mock-up currently in Vauxhall, just with the water being run over this landscape for the first time to help us to test how deep or how shallow these puddles really needed to be in order to create the reflectivity and the kind of sound of the cascading water that we desired. So just to bring the presentation to the end, we're sat now, just emerged from Exchange House. We're at the top of the amphitheatre. We see the retail unit kind of climb out of the landscape, creating a new vantage point from which to both look over the new activity space in the middle, but also into the fantastic structure of Liverpool Street Station. So this is what we hope, or what is emerging at the moment, thanks to our contractors. Hopefully in the not too distant future, something like this will start to emerge. But on a fairly cold day in January, this was how it looked as the site was kind of slowly demolished or kind of disassembled very, very carefully to ensure that the careful loading calculations imposed on this slab that hovers above the railway tracks doesn't deflect to such a degree that it stops the trains from working. And then perhaps just want to finish on slightly snowy February morning. I think it's, I guess the final comment that I would make is that as of Christmas this year, this space will see an increase in the amount of green accessible space by 300%. So as I zoom out, hopefully if it wasn't, if a slightly strange kind of tour around this board didn't make any sense, this was our attempt to, within the context of Zoom and kind of virtual presentations, to give you a slightly spatial tour of the line that kind of weaves through this landscape. So the form of the landscape is in fact the kind of the figure of this presentation, which is perhaps now better captured by this image. So yes, thank you.
Okay. Great, thank you everyone. It was a fantastic presentation, and it's fascinating to see how the project evolved through the different concept phases. And it was very interesting to hear about the different qualities and identities that were selected for the whole development. And I also think within Exchange Square itself, there are so many different pockets of spaces that will attract different users, will have different planting. And I think this leads on to one of the questions that was raised in the by the attendees about to what extent did the solar orientation inspire the design, and how much shade across the side is created by the station's roof. And it's kind of linked to another question that is related to the structural capacity of that platform, which will have to be all of the soil and the structures. So how was that kind of informing the whole design process?
Who wants to take that one? I mean, I know as somebody who doesn't sit in the sun, I think we're all aware, particularly as we head towards 2050, with London being more like Barcelona by then, definitely, an element of shade is something that we embraced rather than retreated from. I don't know, what do you think, James, on the shade front? I mean,
well, but as somebody who does planting, shade and sun are super important to me. And we did do shade studies on the square. For London, it's pretty sunny because the station is comparatively low. And then you have the high building behind it to the north, which is quite shiny. So it's quite a warm space with quite a lot of sun comparatively in London, and particularly in the city of London. But it is quite shady in close proximity to the station. So you can see that the core sort of, don't know how to describe it, maybe the core amenity space for people to sit around on is the amphitheatre, and that's set back from the station in the sun. But then we have a secondary layer under the trees here at the top of the site, with plenty more seating in the shade under the trees. Now, with regard to the planting, that is like a continuous modulation from the shade of the station through the sunny, really strongly planted perennial planting to the shade tolerant naturalistic planting under the birch trees at the top of the site.
We did also, with the loading, that really did limit our choice of tree locations, didn't it? Because we really did want to put far more mature trees, but there was, I don't know if you have those drawings, Tom, you know, these extraordinary loading drawings that actually influence.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you'd think that the when building a slab, such a complicated slab over some railway tracks, you would just kind of engineer the whole thing equally. But I guess one of the biggest surprises to us came when it was realised by Arup, our structural engineers, that actually it had been kind of completely kind of specifically designed to that kind of curling landscape feature that moved through it. So there's incredibly kind of heavy loading beneath the existing water feature to hold the tank of water. There's incredibly heavy loading kind of capacity on this stage feature just next to the lawn, and other areas like the waterfall cascade area, where you know it's assumed that people, there wouldn't be a kind of a live load, were completely kind of underloaded. So our design really, like some of those forms, are very carefully balanced. The retail unit, in fact, sits directly over the tank that captured all the water from the previous water feature to kind of really utilise that kind of extra bit of loading capacity in order to have the accessible roof. It was the only place on the whole site where you could have had an accessible roof to a retail unit as well as a live load below. And other features of kind of the really dense planting, where you have to, I mean, James, you know all about this, but when you kind of weigh or kind of calculate the loading of soil, you have to calculate it for the volume of water plus the soil. So even the kind of structural, kind of the process of calculating these structures is kind of limits use to some extent.
Yeah, and all the while it's over a live railway line as well, isn't it? Sorry, James, I interrupted you.
No. I was just going to say that interestingly, when you plant, there comes a point where you've planted so densely that you can say, well, nobody can possibly gather in this area anymore. And you can start to borrow the live load that might be imposed by people if they were all hanging about somewhere. So the really densely planted flower beds are loaded on the assumption that people will never go on them. And we get, by that mechanism, we're allowed to have more soil for those plants, which we need. The landscape architect always wants as much soil as they can get.
It's interesting how these aspects were reflected in the design, and in a way it tells a story. It's not a project that has been developed on a site where nothing was there. So this kind of there is a relationship there that I think is important in a place like the city. We have another question here that is slightly different. Can you explain a bit further on the landscape interfaces with the perimeter buildings, particularly one exchange square to the east and the covered pedestrian route to exchange arcade into Bishopsgate? Who would like to?
You want to put image
Yeah,
up?
I'll put the screen back up if that's okay. Yeah, so I think your question
might be able to zoom in, I suppose.
Yeah, I think, I mean, this is kind of neatly missing from this plan here, but I think this is like 10 exchange, which I think the question might be referring to rather than one exchange. So there are these steps down here to Apod Street, And then I think you also mentioned conveniently just outside the image as well, this route here through to the Bishopsgate Arcade. So, I mean, I guess kind of in short, you know, when we were in the design of this, we drew a kind of, you know, a much wider extended area of influence. We can't see, unfortunately, this image, but if, for example, the same kind of tree species that James has kind of sourced here are also carried through onto the other side of Exchange House, onto Primrose Street, where there's some kind of integrated planters. And similarly, you know, we are in the process of influencing landscape decisions, you know, beyond the site. So at least there's a horticultural sort of
Do you want to
connection.
zoom in, Tom, on space that detail where by the pavilion that you would, you know, the retail and the steps up? I mean,
Yes, yeah.
There's a hell of a lot of detail in the drawing, sort of. Yeah, that's great. I suppose it was just, we were trying to draw the greenery, as James was saying, as close to that threshold as possible. So as you emerge from this rather sort of dark, low, you know, almost sort of grotto-like experience as you come through from Bishopsgate, you get a hit of greenery. You don't see the whole space immediately. You see this retail, and then it opens out. So I suppose there were some shots that you showed, James, weren't there, of the model that we made, and we would sort of take our mobile phones and sort of take them for a walk and say, and sort of move the cardboard around so that we were sort of playing these quite picturesque games, weren't they, of unfolding views and unfolding landscapes, which I think when you see it in these aerial views don't capture that kind of layering.
Yeah, but I think one thing I would like to mention is that one of the most important things for us was this kind of providing step-free access as much as possible. So, I mean, this view I think really kind of nicely captures the threshold with the Undercroft of Exchange House. At the moment, there's kind of a four-step kind of transition between the Undercroft and Exchange Square, and that really acts as a kind of a device that severs, you know, one from the other, by the simple act of raising the level of the square up to be the kind of the same height as the level of the Undercroft. You immediately kind of reimagine the Undercroft as a covered space that is connected to the square, as opposed to something that is separate and, you know, above or beyond that square. So actually the seamless transition on this whole length for anyone kind of reimagines the space as a kind of a veranda of sorts, where you get a bit of shade, that actually allows kind of really easy kind of, you know, movement that kind of beneath.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that it's a good question about the interfaces with the buildings, but there's a greater question about the interfaces beyond the square. For example, the walkway that goes down the west side of Liverpool Street Station is a very poor connection, which actually severs the public realm in front of the station from Exchange Square. Or because we're at podium level here, all around you have to go down a steep flight of stairs and between a couple of buildings to get into any kind of local streetscape. And that condition goes all the way down the edge of Broadgate as well. So this is one step along the way. Maybe this integrates the spaces surrounding it, but there's a lot more work to be done here to successfully integrate Broadgate as a whole in such a way that it really feels like part of the city that you travel through in a really natural way. I think it's possible, but there's still a lot more work to be done in that regard.
But we did find as well, didn't we? I think you can see if you go on our website, there's a quote which reinforced a phenomenon that we'd observed on other projects, but has actually sort of been proven here, which is even though you have to go up several steps, you know, and you have a difference in heights, and it's a longer route, a substantial number of people are now diverting through Broadgate and going through Broadgate Plaza up to the north, where obviously is pre-pandemic, and choosing to stay amongst the greenery and the biophilia that we all feel, rather than the challenges of Bishopsgate. And we met several people anecdotally who would always be saying, yeah, I come this way, it's a bit longer, but it's quieter, it's calmer. And so we know that people were doing that before Exchange Park has been finished because of that little bit of greenery, you know, greenery in Broadgate Plaza. So we're sort of hopeful that this will draw people through and give them some respite.
Mm-hmm. Great. I have a couple of more questions here that are kind of linked together. So one is about are there any plans for activating the space with events or say food markets, and how could that change throughout the season? And how do you see the seasonal life of this park changing across the months and even the years?
Do you want to answer that, Tom?
I can do, yeah. I mean, I think there will be a whole host of events organised and planned for the space, as there was, as there always has been historically in that square. And for us, one of the key considerations was to make sure that throughout those events, the landscape actually kind of worked with the way that the space used and kind of complemented these events, and that the events could complement the new kind of landscape character of the space, so that they weren't at odds with each other. I mean, some people might remember when the ice rink was in Exchange Square, and it involved kind of almost like decking over the whole site. It completely worked against the kind of the made topography or the landscape. It didn't kind of utilise any of the kind of the existing features of the buildings. So we did do a number of studies when considering how to place and how to scale spaces. That meant that the amphitheatre or the kind of the seating area would be create a focal point at its centre, as opposed to be something that needed to be kind of corrected as a level in order to build new infrastructure to adjust things. So for us, almost, we wanted to make sure that the identity of the space as a park is retained no matter what takes place within it.
Okay.
I've got an answer about seasonality. It's a slightly sideways answer because it's to do with the plants. But I think we felt that seasonality in planting is the enemy of commercial landscaping. And this is why in commercial landscape, you often see annuals used, because you plant the plants, they look nice until they don't, you chuck them away, you put some new annual plants in, and you just keep doing that. So it always looks nice and colourful. And the other go-to kind of plants for commercial landscape are evergreen ones, because they always look green. But what we said in this case is that in order for people to feel a connection to nature, we should actually embrace that seasonality, and we should have times when it's just soil in the flower beds, because that's how it is when you have a garden. But then what is it? Is it uncared for? We said no. What you see there at that moment is the act of people caring for it. And something that we haven't mentioned that I want to talk about a little bit is that at the outset we said what we really need here is a person who really cares for this place, the gardener, and it is their responsibility to look after, but also they're the connection to the community here as it evolves, the people who come and hang out and say, well, what is that plant? Or why is it just soil here? And this person can say, oh, well, I'm looking after it, putting some straw down to keep it warm for the winter, or whatever activity they're doing, putting some manure down. And people see a real living landscape, not a fake one made to please them. And that kind of, for me, that's really important, actually, that kind of welcoming seasonality into these rather harsh landscapes where it tends to get pushed aside.
And it was quite hard to find examples of that in urban centres in London because of this more commercial take. We could find lovely images of Great Dixter, like these extraordinary sort of rural idylls, but translating that into the urban setting was an act of we were kind of ambassadors for nature here. So I at one point even got on a plane for a 48-hour trip to New York at the height of February coldness, just to take images to double check that we were all on board with the idea that we were comfortable with this landscape, particularly well in New York they do it a lot. They really have to cater for extraordinary spans in the weather, but particularly the highline planting was something that reassured the clients and all of us that you can still have this kind of sculptural feel to the dying sort of branches of grasses and blooms that had been left, let nature take its own time. So it was really reassuring to make that trip, and hopefully we'll get to see the result of it in a year.
I think that will be a very interesting aspect of the space also for all the users, not just the office workers. That I mean, this place will become a destination, and for children to come and observe how things will change, I think would be fascinating. There are just a couple of more questions here that I would like to take before we end up the session. One is about is the testing and reviewing of the mock-ups have changed any parts of the design to date? How has the mock-ups been informing like the end product?
Well, you couldn't see in some of the images very clearly, but actually there were multiple different textures, multiple different finishes, so none of them really represented we think this is the best, let's test it. They all actually were utilized as a process of exploring kind of different conditions, so different kind of stair nosings, different kind of levels of bush hammering, even different terrazzo mixes. So from them it was definitely a kind of a process of selecting the best, and then kind of even kind of adapting that based on lessons learnt, rather than just mocking up in order to reassure ourselves. And in fact, I think one of the kind of the main changes that perhaps we can talk about is the that line that traverses the space. I guess the kind of the rustedness of the corten, the cast material, we, over the kind of process of weathering in our yard in Vauxhall for months, we kind of looked at the extent that it stained the ground on the floor, and I guess it did stain it more than we had anticipated, and it continued to for longer. So that now is kind of fixed at kind of darker colour. Is much more like a kind of almost an industrial metal, as opposed to a kind of a worn kind of perhaps like overly aestheticized metal. So decisions like that kind of happened live, and very much with our clients as well, kind of testing and kind of experiencing these things.
Okay, thank you. I think it's very important. Well, I would like to say that maybe it's not often that mock-ups are done for landscape projects. It's only it's mostly like for facades or cladding.
Yeah.
I think that talks a lot about how the process has been really the core of the end design. Well, I think we are already running a few minutes late, so I think I would like to close the session. Thank you very much for that fantastic presentation. And just a final note, thank you everyone for attending the City Architecture Forum talk, and I'd like to encourage you to join then the next one that will be on the 23rd of February with Fletcher Priest talking about their future work project, which explores the evolving workplace and how and where we might work in the future. And that I hope that where we'll be in such great open spaces like what we've seen today. Okay. Great, thank you very much, everyone.